Hey everyone. So I was playing some CS2 with the boys, as one does, and we were having a good time, but something just felt off the entire time. And naturally I whipped out my nearest excuse book. I couldn't blame frame rate, couldn't blame aim. That's it. Input lag. Jokes aside, what really happened is we were playing CS2 and just noticed the aim felt off, almost in an indescribable way. But you know, we were having fun, cracking a few beers, whatever. But then one of our silver friends jumped on, and he didn't have CS2 beta access. Not a problem, we said. We'll boot up CSGO, we'll win a game, we'll get you a rank, and then, hopefully, you'll be in the next CS2 beta wave. But then when we switched after a whole night of playing CS2, we switched back to CSGO, and collectively everyone noticed, almost at the same time, the moment we loaded in, that the aim was different. Something was completely, fundamentally changed. The aim was crisp again. I kept swiping my mouse in circles in spawn, and the snappiness was just back. The deegs were hitting, the enemy team was calling hacks. All was as it should be. And that led me down a dark path. Counter-Strike 2 has an input lag problem. So naturally I perused Twitter, Reddit, YouTube, looking for various tips and fixes, but nobody actually had any data. Just random one-off comments about, oh, you just right-click the file and change this one setting, or oh, you go into the video settings and you change this one thing. Which is a little bit shocking. You know, where's the battle nonsense guy who whips out an entire spreadsheet? But, I mean, seriously, I am going to be the first one to upload this video, otherwise I wouldn't have done this. This isn't normally something that I like doing, and this was incredibly painful to make, I'm not going to lie. I did find one post from a guy on Reddit who recorded the negative impact of raising various video settings, and he found that the average latency was around 14 milliseconds. Based on actually a comment he left, not on the actual post. And that was going to be a good starting point to validate my own data against. Even though my testing isn't going to be related to video settings, it's going to be related to pretty much everything else and how it impacts total latency. Curiously, I'm actually pretty uniquely situated to make this video, being one of the few people who actually has one of the best tools on the market to measure input lag. And then I also play a lot of Counter-Strike Global Offensive, so I'm, Global Elite, Face at level 10, all that good stuff. All right, so here's the setup. I have the fancy-dancy Asus PG27 AQN, wonderful name, which has a built-in USB pass-through and the NVIDIA Reflex Latency Analyzer tool. So here's how it works. You set up an on-screen rectangle and the monitor watches for movement, and then when you click, it records the time your click packet hits the USB hub, records that, and then when it sees motion on the screen, it records that and does a little bit of subtraction to find the total amount of time that elapsed between the two. Pretty simple. So then all I had to do was grab my camera, point it at the screen, and record some values, and voila, we have data. After that, all I had to do was painstakingly enter all the values in a spreadsheet by hand after each run.
That overlay is not the best way to find out what is going on with our system latency. Luckily, we can simply log all data into a CSV file. So for each match I get 2 CSV files.
So here's my setup in terms of hardware. I've got a Ryzen 5800X, rocking some PBO on that. I have 32 gigs of 3600 megahertz CL14 RAM, so I've got my Infinity Fabric 1-to-1. And if anyone knows anything about RAM, CL14 should stand out to you. I have an RTX 4090. I'm still using Windows 10 Pro, which I think is important because there's quite a few various input lag issues specific to Windows 11 that don't exist on Windows 10. I also have a 970 Evo M.2, and that's running my OS as well as the game. I already mentioned the monitor, and then I am using a 1000 Hz Zowie ZA13-B mouse. And that's kind of important because there can be a lot of extra variables when you start loading up 2000, 4000, 8000 hertz mice. All right, so first up, my CSGO measurements. I didn't want to change anything since these are the settings that I've been playing on for years and years more or less, and I know they work to perfection. They've slowly evolved over the course of almost a decade, which I realized last week. Yes, I have the Operation Breakout medal, apparently. My CSGO settings are as follows. I've got full screen optimization turned off. I have game mode turned off, and in the NVIDIA control panel, I've got low latency on, prefer maximum performance, texture filtering on high performance, and I do my display scaling on the NVIDIA GPU. In-game, I'm playing 1920 by 1440, which is effectively 4:3 stretched, but at 1440p. Everything's on all low, except for MSAA. And for the person who is now furiously typing that the whole problem is related to me playing stretched, don't you worry, we'll test native in a moment. So in order to prep for testing, I ran DDU, which is display driver uninstaller. It nukes your graphics drivers effectively. And then I grabbed the latest NVIDIA Studio driver from NVIDIA's website. It's version 536.99. And that's important because I think 2, maybe even 3 NVIDIA driver versions ago, back in May, they released an update for cs2. So if you're playing on an older NVIDIA driver, you'll definitely want to get that updated to at least 536, if not higher. All right. So first up, CSGO to get a baseline. I chose this dark corner on Dust 2 since the map is seemingly the least dramatically changed between versions of the game. Also because the latency analyzer tool works best when you have like a dark area and then a bright muzzle flash. It allows it to more easily see what's happening. And also it's Counter-Strike. How could I not use Dust 2? So I ran a couple preliminary tests without recording the data. I just want to make sure that everything was working. I turned on a few settings, I turned off a few settings, tested A, B, just to make sure everything was as it should be. And then I recorded 200 samples with the Glock. What I noticed in my spreadsheet is that after about 60 samples, the data didn't really meaningfully change at all. So I'm going to use 60 as my sample size, mostly for my sanity. All right, 60 shots into the wall later, and we've got our data. I went ahead and added min, max, average, and standard deviation values. More on those later. All right, so now into CS2 where I do the same test, but first I turned everything back to stock. No more launch options, no full screen optimizations, nothing. Everything was stock in the NVIDIA control panel. I ran FPS_max 0 to uncap my frame rate, and I was getting about 900 FPS staring at the wall in CS2, which is identical to what I was getting in CSGO, about 900. So now I'll get 60 gushes with the Glock and throw some numbers in the spreadsheet, and whoa. So the maximum latency doubled, and more importantly, the standard deviation is huge. All right, no need to panic. Everyone says native is better. We're going to switch to native, no display scaling, no nothing. I rebooted my game, rebooted my computer, turned off display scaling entirely. Everything's as it should be. And native is the same. Not great. It's actually a little bit worse because of the extra pixels it had to render. So, for everyone on Reddit who said that their mouse felt floaty, well, you were spot on. This is probably why. Almost every other measurement was 7 milliseconds, then 20, then 7 again, then 20 again. It's hard to explain why that's bad. Think about it in terms of a conveyor belt, where standard deviation is how far apart your inputs are. So in CSGO, everything's coming down the conveyor belt pretty neatly. You know, a few items are closer together and a few items are further apart, but nothing that's going to cause chaos or cause the conveyor belt to get overwhelmed. In CS2, however, the standard deviation is so high, the conveyor belt has pieces of data that are right up next to each other, and then ones that are miles apart, and then right next to each other again, and then miles apart. And I think that's the root cause of the problem. It's not really that the latency is 20 milliseconds, it's that the pacing fluctuates so wildly. Now, it's worth noting that my setup can only measure the latency of clicks, not the latency of data coming off the sensor of the mouse. My assumption, however, is that they probably have the same behavior. meaning that as you swipe your mouse across the pad, the information is arriving in wildly untamed fashion, which creates that floaty feeling. Alright, so cs2 has a massive input deviation problem. That's the root of the issue. How do we actually fix it? Well, let's try a few things that just seem intuitive at first. I started with disabling full screen optimizations and relaunched, and it did nothing. I enabled reflex in the in-game settings, which did nothing. And it's worth noting as well that as I'm going through these settings and testing, I am turning things back off that I turned on in the previous step, just to not mix up variables. So next up, I enabled ultra low latency in the NVIDIA control panel, and it helped, but only a little. Even within run-to-run variants, you might say. All right. So then I tried turning on Windows 10 game mode, and oh my dear God, turn it off. I don't know how Microsoft just consistently gets things wrong, but they do. All right, so the next one is interesting. I tried capping my frame rate at 500 instead of the 900 I was getting. I was hoping that that would add a little bit more stability. It should have increased my latency slightly and lowered the standard deviation. And it did, but not to the degree that I was hoping it would. So capping your frame rate, not a solution. All right, enough fooling around. I'm going to copy over all of my CSGO settings and just use them all on CS2. I've taken way too long going through all of these settings. Let's just give it a big swing. And it's the same. All right. So here's where I ran out of ideas. It was time for conspiracies, dark rabbit holes, all in my search for the holy grail of input lag fixes. I went to Reddit. So this video is way too long, and I don't feel like explaining things anymore, so let me just speed run the rest of this. Vulkan did nothing. Deleting the Steam overlay might have helped, but it's within run-to-run variants. G-Sync and V-Sync, they do make it smoother, and they do lower your standard deviation, but they do that by increasing the input lag. Don't use them. I couldn't test Dash Insecure, because the console output, I looked through the console in CS2, and it told me that VAC was already turned off, even without Dash Insecure, and I think that's because I was playing on an offline server. So if Dash Insecure is the part of the problem that people are reporting on Twitter, then my testing's already showing it's bad enough. I don't even want to begin to test this online. I feel like it's going to be even worse. So keep that in mind. Hardware accelerated GPU scheduling did nothing. All right, so at this point, my fingers were bleeding. The spreadsheet was out of RAM. The internet was out of ideas. I had input lag in my arms, and my fourth cup of coffee had run dry. But I had one idea left. One that was so destructive, it might invalidate all my other testing. I decided to use an AK-47 instead of the Glock, because what if the Glock just had an animation lag this entire time? It would invalidate all my other testing. For good measure, I went ahead and when I used the AK, I went ahead and lowered the settings to 640 by 480 resolution, the lowest you can select. And thank God the numbers still held. Whew. I mean, the numbers are awful, but can you imagine if that was just a Glock animation glitch after all that? All right, enough of the nonsense. I've tested effectively everything that I can think to test and everything that everyone else on the internet said fixed it magically. So I'm going to pile together all the placebo effects that I have now gathered, and I'm going to put them all into one last test. One last huzzah. These wouldn't just be test settings. These would be the settings that would fix it and the settings that I would run daily forevermore. I had resizable bar enabled. I had my chosen res. I capped my FPS at 500 for that extra stability. I had all the settings on low, MSAA on, reflex still off, the settings in the NVIDIA control panel. I tweaked to perfection. I turned off all of the Windows garbage. I deleted the Steam overlay, and the results were nothing short of pure disappointment. It's the same. Still the same. So, out of all the tests I did, everything was just run-to-run variance, placebo effects, just pure luck. Except for one run. The run I did on Counter-Strike Global Offensive, with its standard deviation of 2 and 11 milliseconds of latency. So here's the conclusion. Counter-Strike 2 has an input lag problem. The delay also isn't something you can get used to. If it was just 20 milliseconds constant, that wouldn't really be a problem. It's not really that perceivable. But when it's fluctuating between 6 and 20 and 6 and 20, it's no longer something you can just get used to because it's just wildly inconsistent. Now, what I'd like to see is this a me problem or is this an everyone problem? I think it's an everyone problem, but I don't have a second computer to test with. So if anyone else has the technology to test this, either an LDAT or NVIDIA Reflex Latency Analyzer, I would love to see your numbers and see if you find a fix, because it's really annoying to play CS2 right now. If anyone from Valve cares to reach out and do some debugging with me, you can find me on Twitter. And of course, it's worth noting that this is a beta, and the purpose of this video is to give everyone something to blame when they die. I mean, to provide feedback to the developers. All right, Valve, please fix.